Inner Discipling Week 4. What is sin? Triggering, re-triggering the observer position. So here we are at session 4, and this is one of many of the big and maybe the biggest hurdle we have to get over to use this method and this model well, because the main idea in this session is the idea, what is sin? What is sin? And the three ideas we're going to look at is triggering, re-triggering, and what we call the observer position. In terms of the idea of what is sin, we're going to use Romans 8 verse 7, and we're going to be looking at page 28 in the book, which I've got here. So here's my Bible. This is the NIV, but by all means, use whatever version you have. In fact, I like using different versions. I think it helps. So let me read Romans 8 verse 7. The sinful mind, and by the way, even the NIV here says, or the mind set on the flesh in the notes. It says, or the mind set on the flesh. I would use a modern version. I would say the mind, the triggered mind. I would put it that way. So the mind of sinful man, the sinful mind is hostile to God. So you could say the triggered mind is in opposition to God. It's the same thing. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Now, I simply cannot tell you how important it is that you grasp this idea, that you understand what sin actually is. Maybe we should start by reading from the book, and then I'll maybe speak to that. Let me read from page 28. What is sin? We quote from 1 Corinthians 4 verse 3 about not judging ourselves, because I guess that's what we do a lot. Paul says there, I don't even judge myself, and neither should you. So, you may think you have sin sorted. At least in our understanding, you've not in practice. It's simple, right? God is good, the devil is evil, black, white. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Satan is the father of all lies. Therefore, we hate and run away from everything sinful and move towards everything that is good. Well, sure, in principle, but there's a lot more to it. If it were really that simple, God would not have sent his son to rescue us, but probably just abandoned us to our fate. You see, when we reflect more deeply on what sin really is, we get a more useful idea. Now, the dictionary definition of sin is an immoral act considered to be a transgression against divine law. So sin is something that goes against God's law. Well, how does it do that? We could get a little bit circular here and say, well, because it's evil. But that doesn't really get us very far. We just go around in a circle again. I want you to think of sin as something more understandable, as something we cannot actually avoid. So let's take some examples from the disciples. Although I'm sure you could probably add many examples from your own life. Ask yourself this. In John 18 verse 10, when Peter cut off the ear of Malchus, the guard, did he think he was doing an evil thing or a good thing? What do you think? Well, he clearly thought that things would work out better if he resisted what the guards were doing with some force of his own. Now, of course, it was wrong, and Jesus brought him back in line immediately. Put the ear back on, told him to put away his sword, and helped him to understand that he was getting in the way of Jesus' ministry, what God had sent him here to do. The point is that Peter was trying to make a good thing happen. And that is the point you need to get hold of. As long as you're thinking of sin as this sort of consciously evil thing that just wants to do evil things, you've not even started to understand the true nature of it. Let's give you another example. In Matthew 20, verse 21, did James and John or their mother think they were being evil when they asked if they could sit next to him left and right in his kingdom? Again, it was clearly wrong and sinful, but Salome thought she was doing a good thing, at least for them. And of course, that's the point. Sin happens mainly when people put their interests before God's. But the problem is your brain does this naturally. In fact, Romans 8 verse 7 tells us it can't do anything else. It always puts you first because it hasn't got the faintest idea who God is. You might as well try and explain God to a ham sandwich as explain it to this back room. And it's described best, I would say, in Luke 12 and verse 13, known as the parable of the rich fool. Jesus calls this greed and tells us to watch out for it, teaching us that life is more than the accumulation of things. But of course, this is something only your mind can get hold of, not your brain. Now in Romans 14:23, sorry, I know I'm giving you a lot of references here, but look them all up by all means and study them. In Romans 14:23, Paul tells us that when we are in doubt, then we are sinning, because it doesn't come from faith. Now, just think about that. He's saying, even when you're in a little bit of doubt, that's a sin. Well, it is, because it's in opposition to God. Does this fit your definition of sin as simply an evil thing? In Jeremiah 10 and verse 23 and 24, we're reminded that we are not capable of discerning the right rules for life. Jeremiah is saying to us, he has to come from God because you can't even work it out for yourself. Well, we can't. Only God can do this. My point is, in these examples, it is not that they were not sinful. Of course they were sinful, but rather that these actions were well-intentioned. They were trying to make a good thing happen by their own values. And this is the key point in developing your recovery, developing your growth and development, and it's through an improved relationship with your parts, as we're going to understand them. So rather than go into a deeper analysis of this idea, I want to stop here and make the point relevant to your growth. You need to understand that sin is an inevitable result of self-interest. Let me say that again. Your sin is an inevitable result of self-interest, and your brain is only interested in you. You also need to understand that the part of you that does the sinning wants to make a good thing happen in terms of its own values. Until you understand that most sinful motivation and think of it this way, you'll not be able to make the vital step towards working with your parts. You will simply continue to fight your parts in a battle you'll mostly lose. Your parts are like anxious little children left on their own, having to come up with solutions. Does that describe the disciples at all before Jesus came? Needing a parent, right? Remember that Jesus was full of compassion when he saw people. He said they were like sheep without a shepherd. These parts are trying their best to make a good thing happen, but without any experience, wisdom, or concern for the greater good. Most importantly, no understanding of who God is or what God is. So just like the disciples. So let's remind ourselves what Jesus did with them, because that's what we have to follow, right? That is our model. We're trying to do what Jesus did. Remember that button we used to wear years ago? What would Jesus do, right? Well, this is it. So let me ask you, how are you dealing with this view of the sinful nature? How are you dealing with your parts, those thoughts you have, those behaviors you have, those attitudes you have? Are you hating them? Are you hiding them? Are you ashamed of them? Or are you working with them like Jesus did? If you're attending a modern style of church, they'll probably be quoting from a modern translation in their sermons and their teaching. And I've noticed that the more modern the translation, the more fighting the talk. Let's take this example from Galatians 5:17. It's one of the best examples. The Good News translation describes the relationship between the spirit and the flesh as being enemies. And the Living Translation, the New Living Translation, says that they are constantly fighting each other. The Voice version says that there is a constant battle raging between them. Now compare those three versions with the King James that simply says that they're contrary to one another. Contrary. Does that sound a bit different? Or most traditional versions, which say that they are in opposition to one another. So God's will and your flesh are simply going in different directions. That's it. That's all it is. They're in opposition to one another. So what I'm saying does not contradict the Bible. Please hear this in the right way, but expands the understanding of the model Jesus provided when he discipled sinners. Remember, Matthew 7:11, he called the disciples evil to their face. But what did he do with them? Did he hate them? Did he fight them? Did he expel them? No, he worked with them. He loved them. He ended up saying that I'm going to call you friends, not servants. That's what Jesus did. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. So this then helps us to see perhaps more subtle ideas of what exists naturally within you as a human being. Look at the table below to understand we're going to use this idea to create harmony rather than conflict within yourself. Now, that is the table that we used the other week, where we talked about the world and God's kingdom, and we drilled it right down to the brain and the mind. In other words, the flesh and the spirit. So, I hope that gives you an idea of, or at least helps you to question the idea of what is sin. Because if you don't get this, if you don't get over this hurdle, how are you going to work with your parts? How are you going to see them? What are you going to do? You're going to think of them in ways that are really not helpful. So we're going to look at the ideas now of triggering, re-triggering, and the observer position. So let me just explain briefly. In this fourth session, we're going to be looking at what neuroscience has taught us, okay? We're going to be saying, well, this is the scientific version, which has now been evidence-based. It's now been proven that these things are real. And then in session 5 and session 6, the last two sessions of the course, we're going to be looking at the biblical version of that truth. In other words, that neuroscience actually has just caught up with the Bible, really. So that'll be the next section. So now we're going to talk about triggering and what is essentially the scientific view of what's going on with you, after which in the last two sessions we'll look at the biblical view and how science is actually catching up with this. So I'm going to talk from page 37 of the book, and we're quoting Romans 7 verse 20. So let me start by quoting that to you. I've got my NIV here. Romans 7:20 says, the NIV, "Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it." So, this is a term you may not have heard before, the idea of triggering. What is that? You may not have even considered that or heard of it before. Let me first of all explain what it is. Remember, your mind, your conscious or core self, runs your life. You're making choices, decisions all day long, but it's only running it on license from your brain. This license can be revoked at any time in milliseconds, thousandths of a second, particularly, of course, if things go wrong. Anytime your brain decides that you are threatened, it will shut you, your mind, down and it will take over. We've all experienced this many, many times in our life. You may know this actually as the fight or flight idea. So how does my brain, you might be asking, get trained in these ways? Why does it take over? And so on, and what's going on here? Well, this idea of your brain deciding on whether you're threatened or not is governed by your life experiences, just as it was with the disciples. This is a really important point, because if you don't understand this, you will continue to think of yourself as broken or needing fixing, and that is the medical model. So your brain is making decisions based upon your life experiences. What do we mean by that? In other words, you have trained it to think of certain things as threatening. And so when it reacts to protect you, it's simply working really well. It's working based on what you have trained it. And basically, it's really good at following training. It's brilliant at this. Your brain will continue to think of these things as threatening until you retrain it. Now, the good news from neuroscience is that you can retrain it. And in fact, it loves to be trained and retrained. We sometimes call this rewiring in the therapeutic world. So the training is simply a matter of your brain seeing you follow the same thought behavior pattern again and again and storing it. How many times have you reacted the same way to the same issue? Well, your brain watches everything you do and it stores it and says, yeah, I know your preference. Now I know what to do. And it just keeps doing it. Remember, your brain is literally watching everything you do and is constantly rewiring itself to put this new learning into practice. In fact, this is great evidence that your brain is working really well, as I say. It's quite brilliant at learning, storing the knowledge and reproducing it when the circumstances require it. Think about how many times and for how many years you've followed certain thought or behavior patterns. Well, your brain's learned them all and has stored them all as reactions to threat for you. So why is this so important? Well, remember that your front room, your mind, has a lot of sophistication. You will assess the level of threat in very subtle ways. Your back room, the brain, simply has an on and off switch. If you train your brain that this thing, this circumstance is a threat to you, it will assume you're going to die. If it doesn't protect you, that switch will simply go on. Think animal in the jungle, and you get the idea. There's no subtlety here. If your brain takes you to be under threat, it takes your safety very seriously, and it will simply get you out of there. Now, if you want an example of the idea of how simple this part of your brain is, and how actually it's very easily fooled, no matter how brilliant it is, it's very easily fooled. In fact, it's very cautious. When we watch a film, a feature film, that is in our minds, we know perfectly well that we're watching actors and lights, cameras and scripts and so on. But the feelings we have when we're watching the film are real. They're not fake, they're not fake feelings, are they? Right? That's because our brain simply takes the information that's coming from the front room to the back room and accepts it as information. The question, is this information real or is it imaginary? That simply isn't, that part of your brain is not capable of asking a question like that. Just think about, these films, think about your feelings, right? It can make us jump out of our skins. It can make us become anxious or laugh or cry. So whilst your brain is incredibly complex, remember, it's easily fooled. Now, the best way, or one good way at least, of thinking about this is to see your brain as a computer which receives information. When you tap letters and numbers into a computer, the computer never asks if the information is real or imaginary. Your input is simply understood as information. So it's this perspective the flesh or the brain has about what is truly important that Jesus spoke about a lot. It's that perspective we're interested in. Take Matthew 10 verse 28 for instance, where Jesus says, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Now your brain is designed to protect you from the threats to your body and operates on caution. Jesus is saying we need to train ourselves to not be acting and reacting in that animal fashion as if our body is the most important thing. As long as you're still breathing, at the end of the day, your brain will feel that it's done its job. This is why your brain can bring thoughts and strong compulsions to do things that are unhealthy or downright risky. Following the years of training where you've shown your brain what your solution looks like, it learns to offer you that same solution every time the bad thing happens. If this training did not happen, we'd only react based upon real threats and dangers. So for instance, think about it this way. When you were 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years of age, things that may have felt like a threat to you are then stored, and they're still stored as if they're threatening when you're now an adult. But of course, they're not threatening anymore, but your brain hasn't received new training. So you are triggered when your brain perceives you to be threatened. That's what triggering means. At this point, your brain shuts down your mind and takes over. Who you think of as you, who I am, is not always in charge of your life. As you learn more about how you're triggered and what triggers you, you may be shocked to find just how much time you spend in a triggered state and how long you actually remain in that state. You're going to learn how to use these threats and triggered states to grow in your recovery and your personal development. Now let's maybe stop there for a minute and look at, hopefully that's explained to you the idea of triggering. And Paul writes about that very simply in Romans 7:20. He's basically describing the triggered state. He's saying, that's not me. That's not me. What is essentially me, my Christ-mindedness, my consciousness, my spirit, actually, that's not what is in charge when I'm doing what I don't want to do, right? Remember that it's the medical model that says you're up and down and changeable and moody and sometimes you're a bit crazy, you do things you don't want to do. No, you are consistent. You are God's masterpiece. Remember Ephesians 2 verse 10. Basically, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. If you decide you want to do something, you're not going to change. You're not going to say, oh, well, yesterday I want to do that, but today I've just changed my mind or something. No, you have a belief, right? And you are steadfast in that belief, but your brain has no idea what's going on. Now, as we talk about re-triggering in the next section, you'll understand this better. So let's talk about re-triggering now. Once you are in this triggered state, how do we gain control again over ourselves? How do we get back into our Christ consciousness, our self-leadership, as it were? Well, we're going to talk about actual techniques and methods in the course itself. But for now, I just want to read from the book, which will be page 41, if you've got a copy of that. And the scripture, again, I've got the NIV here, is actually Philippians 4 verse 7. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. What does that mean? Well, the reason I've chosen that quote is because what it's saying is that the peace of God passes all understanding. What that means is it doesn't make sense in terms of your circumstance. It's not saying that you'll be at peace with yourself if things are going well, or that you'll be fine as long as everything goes your way. It says it's actually outside of that kind of understanding. And Jesus himself says, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives. And so this is something we need to get hold of. is that you can re-trigger your adult. You can be in charge. You can be in control of yourself, even when circumstances are against you. So let me read from page 41. In case you didn't get this yet, I want to be clear about something. The resources God has supplied you with are perfect. When the Bible says that the peace of God passes all understanding, it means that there's no natural reason why we should experience such calm based on our lived experience. When we see God's people forgive those who have murdered their loved ones, we know we are seeing something supernatural, something that would never come from the flesh. So when we talk about calm, we mean perfect calm. It's so amazing to realize that neuroscience testing has shown that we all have these resources, no matter what our past has been like. If these resources come from God, then you would expect two things. First, they would be perfect. And secondly, that they would be untainted by your lived experience. They wouldn't be affected by how abused you've been, how ignored you've been, how difficult your life has been. And that's, again, two key points to get hold of. And that is exactly what you'll find when you practice the observer position. We're going to talk about that in the next section, what the observer position is. When you employ these methods, along with taking the observer position, you are likely to re-trigger your authentic self. Although the part or the disciple within you may not step back completely, after all, no one likes to give up power, you may initially experience something like the lessening of the feelings that the part brings if it makes you feel anxious or if it makes you feel frightened or angry or whatever. Remember Peter, for instance, he actually rebuked Christ, and said, no, come on, you're not wrong about that, Jesus, that I'm never going to let that happen. They don't always obey immediately, in other words. But even a small amount of success in this area will change your experience of certain events or challenges. It's not only life that triggers you. Your brain makes very little distinction between what's real and what's observed and works with information only. Remember I said that the feelings we have when we're watching a film are very real. You can trigger yourself. It happens all the time. And this can become a very useful and safe exercise. Let's try this now. Try sitting in a comfortable and safe place when you've got a minute to yourself and start to think about the last time this extreme feeling came over you, this thing happened, this triggering thing. Now you may find that this is enough to trigger the same feelings again, but maybe not as strong. Use this as an exercise, as there's no better time to talk to your parts than when they're fully present. Right? You can literally trigger yourself by just thinking about the event that happened, and you can use that as a way of starting that relationship. So using this as an exercise is a good idea. Keep checking that you're still curious about your part's feelings and ideas. If you lose your curiosity, if you find that you're slipping too much into the feeling itself and you start maybe judging yourself, take a break. Start again later. All you have to do is step out of it and you can try again later. Remember that you're in a safe place. It's not actually happening. You're just remembering what happened. So once you achieve this observing state, you can begin to start a better relationship with your parts. Inner discipling begins when you recognize your parts as separate from yourself and relate to them as their Lord and Master. When you start talking to them in a way that corrects them, in a way that assures them, in a way that loves them. Remember that we're trying to create inner harmony here, or what could be called trust or acceptance of you as their leader. So try to remain calm and friendly with all parts, even if the progress is slow. If the parts overwhelm you, see how much you can learn from that experience. Forgive yourself and try again later with some of the approaches the Lord took with his disciples. Always trying your best to develop a better relationship with that part. Remember, compassion is one of your key resources. Now, if you need to feel more yourself or you need to get control back at any time, just ask yourself any question that begins with, I wonder. When you preface your question with, I wonder, such as, I wonder how I'm feeling now, or I wonder how old this part is, or I wonder what this part's trying to do. Any self-reflective question like this will have the effect of waking you up, as the authentic self is the only part of you that would be interested in a question that has curiosity, I wonder, to do with it. Genuine curiosity is something that only you will have. Your parts will not. Remember, parts are always certain. They're not curious. They're simple. And so when you look at the disciples, when you look at the Gospels and the disciples' behavior in the Gospel, remember that they were always certain about things. And very rarely were they curious, except in this very definite way. So that is the idea of re-triggering. What you're doing is you are gaining control back from any triggered state. And in the next section, we're going to talk about the observer position, which is critical, it's vital to re-triggering. You won't really be able to re-trigger, or you won't really be able to work with your disciples either unless you develop this observer position. So we're here at the final part of session 4, the observer position. And I'm going to be reading from page 55 in the book, if you have a copy of that. And I'm going to be quoting particularly from 1 Corinthians 2:16, which actually basically quotes from Isaiah 40, verse 13, which is where Christ first appears in the story of Isaiah. We're also going to be looking at Luke 15:17, which of course is this moment in the younger son's life in the parable of the prodigal. In fact, I think I'm saying it's where Jesus is actually literally describing the observer position for us. So let's first of all look at this idea of 1 Corinthians 2:16. Actually, I'm going to start from verse 15 before the quote. It says, the spiritual man makes judgments about all things, but he himself is not subject to any man's judgment, which is in keeping with what Paul said earlier, that he doesn't even judge himself. For who has known the mind of the Lord that he may instruct him? Now that's the bit from Isaiah 40 verse 30. But we have the mind of Christ. So it's this idea that I'm interested in, that we have the mind of Christ, that the observer position is literally Christ in us. It's our Christ consciousness. So let me read now from page 55 in the book. How do you decide what you think about something? How are you viewing and thinking about your own behavior? One of the main keys to this whole approach is what I call the observer position. It's only from this position that you can begin to work with the parts that are protecting you. In other words, that you can begin inner discipling. We've already looked at one of the best examples of this in the Bible, which is the prodigal in Luke 15 and verse 17. I urge you to study this and make your own mind up about it. But you see, when the younger son turns again to himself, or comes to his senses in more modern versions, he is actually taking the observer position. He's looking at himself from a position that does not come from his feelings or his difficulties. Rather, it's a position that observes these things from a higher perspective. Isn't it fascinating? When you read this, you can see how this reaction that he gets when he comes to his senses is like a surprise. It's quite a shock for his true self to discover the situation he's actually in. Where has that true self been over the last weeks, months, or it could have even been years? We don't know how long it took him to spend all this money. But what we know is that his authentic self, what we are calling his Christ consciousness, is surprised to find the condition that he's in. He's saying, what is going on here? Even people who work for my Father are in a better position than this, and here I am starving to death. Well, did he not know that the day before or the week before? It's like this part has been asleep. And that's what it's like sometimes to take the observer position. Back to the book. It is from this position that you will begin to disciple your flesh or your parts. The observer position is your Christ consciousness within you. When you asked him into your life, he promised he would come in and be with you. That's Revelation 3 verse 20. He then lives in the upper room of your mind and helps you understand and correct your behavior through this observer position. So I want you to think about the last time you acted out of proportion, extreme behavior. It could be that you got angry over some small thing. It could be the last time you were really frightened over something that held no real threat to you. It could be the last time you overreacted to loneliness by watching porn or some film you shouldn't have watched. Or overreacted to anxiety by taking drugs or drinking alcohol. Have you spent too much time at work as a way of avoiding people? As long as you believe these things to be you, your only response to this behavior is the usual stuff of the medical model, which is, shame, self-loathing, with maybe some denial or fighting yourself, etc., etc. But once you know that this is actually a part of you that acts autonomously and has actually different opinions from your adult self, as in, we looked in the last session about Mark 9:24, where this guy talks about, I've got belief and unbelief living within me. It's only then that you can use these times to make progress by taking the observer position. So next time you are out of proportion in your feelings, thoughts, or your attitude, try to avoid judging yourself and observe what's happening. A quick point here about feelings. Most people reading this will believe that it's the type of feelings that they're having that's the main problem. If you're frequently angry or depressed or frightened or lonely, you might think of this as your real problem. Chopping feelings up into good and bad. It makes sense then to develop strategies that help you avoid these feelings, such as taking drugs or drinking alcohol, gambling, watching porn, working so much, all of which dull or remove your feelings. But I want you to know that the feeling is never the issue. It's the proportion of the feelings when compared to your circumstances, that's the issue. So stop chopping feelings up into good and bad and think about the size of the feeling. Think about the proportion. If your reaction is in proportion to the circumstance that you're in, then it is your core self. You're really feeling these things, and it's appropriate. When you react in a way that's out of proportion, you can be certain that you're in a triggered state and that a part of you, your brain, has taken over. In other words, there's no such thing as a bad feeling. They're all real feelings, and Jesus had them all. Remember that Jesus was angry in Matthew 21 verse 13. Jesus was sad in John 11 and verse 35. And Jesus was frustrated, as in Matthew 17 verse 17. Jesus was anxious, as in Matthew 26 39. So remember, it's not the feelings, but always the proportion that's the issue. Now, taking the observer position in the way that I'm describing, it takes practice. And one of the things that you're going to learn about is that it's not just a matter of looking at yourself, because your parts can do that. If you understand that your parts don't always like each other, they judge each other. And this happened in the disciples as well. We've got all of this as part of our model. Jesus said to them several times, what are you arguing about? What are you going on about amongst yourselves, you know. Remember, the disciples didn't always like each other, and your parts don't always like each other. So if you're looking at a part and you're feeling angry about that part or judgmental about that part, that's not you. That is simply a part viewing another part, right? That's one part of you judging another part of you. You have to keep stepping back. And you'll know when you achieve the observer position. Why? Mainly because you will feel compassion towards the parts. If you don't feel that compassion, you haven't achieved it yet. You see, Jesus looked at people and he said, they're like sheep without a shepherd. He felt great compassion for them. And until we achieve that, we haven't stepped back far enough. So it's okay to step back and view a part viewing a part. As long as you're observing the whole thing with compassion, then you've achieved something really useful. So as I say, in the course, we'll talk about practical and you know, methods of doing this. And as long as you remember that it takes practice, okay? So I hope you got a lot from that. And yeah, I think we're getting to the key issues now. And the next 2 sessions will all be about practice. They'll be about true inner discipling, how to understand it and how to practice it. So until next time, bye for now.